The desert doesn't forgive mistakes. Sergeant Dak Holt had learned that truth 22 years ago in a place he never talked about anymore, in a country whose name still showed up in his dreams. He had carried that lesson through 8 combat deployments, through the kind of operations that never made the news, through the funerals of men whose faces he still saw when the lights went out. The desert doesn't forgive. You either see what's coming or you don't come back. He was standing on the tarmac at Nellis Air Force Base, Nevada at 6 in the morning, reading a personnel file for the 3rd time, trying to make the numbers add up. They wouldn't. 19 years old, 6 months out of advanced sniper training, 0 combat deployments. The name at the top of the page was Ava Mercer, and the photograph showed a young woman with dark eyes and a quiet face that gave away exactly nothing. The kind of face that either belonged to someone who had never been tested or someone who had been tested so many times she had stopped reacting to it. Holt didn't know which one this was. He closed the file. Behind him, Chief Garrett Pruitt was doing what Pruitt always did before a bad day, standing with his arms crossed, his jaw set, his eyes moving over the horizon like he was already calculating distances. 15 years with the teams. 4 confirmed kills beyond 2,000 meters. The kind of shooter who understood that precision wasn't about the rifle, it was about the man behind it, or in this case, the woman. Pruitt had read the file too. 0 combat deployments, Pruitt said without turning around. I read it. She's 19. I read that too. Pruitt turned then, and his expression carried the particular weight of a man who has buried friends. Not anger. Something colder than anger. Responsibility. Langley sent us a kid, Dak. We've got a contractor pinned down 42 kilometers behind the line, a 6-hour extraction window, and they sent us a kid with a rifle nobody's ever heard of. Holt didn't answer right away. He looked back at the file, at the name of the man who had signed the recommendation. Master Chief Frank Mercer, United States Navy, retired, deceased 14 months ago, pancreatic cancer. Holt had served under Frank Mercer in 2008. 1 deployment. 8 months in a place where the mountains went up forever and the air tasted like dust and altitude. Frank Mercer had been the kind of man who existed in every branch of the military, but was almost never seen the kind whose reputation arrived 3 days before he did, who could read terrain the way other men read maps, who understood that patience was not a passive thing, but the most active discipline a soldier could practice. 3 weeks before Frank died, he had called Holt. Not his commanding officer, not the chaplain. Holt. The conversation had lasted 4 minutes. Frank's voice had been thin at the end, worn down by the treatment, but his words were completely clear. He said, "My granddaughter is going to show up at your door eventually. She doesn't know I'm asking you this. Don't tell her. Just give her one real chance. Not a courtesy, a real one." Then he said she built the rifle herself. It took her 3 years. Trust the rifle. Then he hung up. Holt had not told anyone about that call. Not Pruitt, not Colonel Diane Marsh, not anyone. He had filed it away in the place where he kept the things that shaped his decisions without explaining them, and he had waited. Now a Black Hawk was coming in low over the ridge, and the waiting was over. The helicopter touched down, hard rotors still screaming, and Holt watched the ramp drop. 3 personnel stepped off. 2 were aircrew. The 3rd was Ava Mercer, and she was smaller than her photograph suggested, which had seemed impossible until this moment. She couldn't have been more than 5'6". The flight suit looked borrowed. She carried a rifle case that was nearly as long as she was tall, gripping it with both hands, leaning slightly into the rotor wash, like she was bracing against weather she had expected. She did not look at the men watching her. She did not scan the tarmac with the reflexive wariness that combat experience builds into a person. She simply walked toward the operations building with her head down and her grip steady. Pruitt watched her cross the tarmac and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "That's our overwatch." It wasn't a question. "That's our overwatch," Holt confirmed. Pruitt's jaw tightened. He watched Ava disappear through the ops building door. Then he looked at Holt with an expression that contained 22 years of hard-won judgment. "I've seen kids freeze up in training with nothing on the line. No wind, no contact, no stakes. Clean range, sunny morning cardboard targets, and they still lock up because their brain couldn't close the distance between practice and real. You put a 19-year-old with 0 combat time on a ridge 3 kilometers from a live extraction, and she is going to get people killed." "Maybe," Holt said. "Not maybe. Set up the range demonstration for 0800. Let's see what she can do before we bury her." Pruitt looked at him for a moment longer than necessary. Then he walked away. Holt looked back at the tarmac at the space where Ava Mercer had been and thought about a 4-minute phone call and a dying man's voice. Trust the rifle. Trust the... The briefing room smelled like bad coffee and recirculated air. Holt's full team had assembled by 0730 Pruitt against the far wall with his arms crossed. Chief Boone Taggart sorting through a bag of breaching charges with the focus of a man who found comfort in orderly equipment. Medic Scott Farley reading something on his tablet. Officer Colt Wren sitting forward with his elbows on his knees, young enough to still find the tension exciting rather than exhausting. Ava sat in the corner. Not because anyone had told her to. Not because she was being excluded, though she was being ignored, which was a particular variety of exclusion that military organizations had perfected. She had found the chair with the least visibility and arranged herself in it, precisely the rifle case across her knees, her eyes moving slowly around the room without settling on anyone. Holt watched her do this and recognized it. Frank Mercer used to do the same thing when he entered an unfamiliar space. Not fear, assessment. The quiet, systematic cataloging of a room before committing to a position within it. The mission briefing was straightforward. Contractor named McKay, civilian engineer wrong place at badly wrong time, had been separated from his convoy 42 kilometers northwest. He was holed up in an abandoned agricultural compound in the Nevada desert, 18 hours without contact with a militia group tightening the search pattern around him. The compound sat in a natural depression surrounded by low hills and 3 kilometers of open ground on every approach, which made it, as Taggart put it with characteristic economy, a kill box. That's why we need Overwatch, Holt said, and the room shifted and every eye went to Ava. Mercer will position here on this ridge 3.2 kilometers southeast. She'll have sight lines on the full approach and the compound's north and east faces, Pruitt spoke. 3 kilometers is beyond effective range for most designated marksman Dak. In desert conditions, with heat shimmer and crosswind variables, you're asking her to provide meaningful fire support from a distance where most experienced shooters are guessing. The room waited. Ava said, 3,200 meters. It was quiet enough that everyone heard it. Pruitt looked at her. What? The ridge to the compound's north entrance. It's 3,200 meters, not 3,000. And the rifle is a Remington 700. Modified action custom barrel hand-loaded ammunition. She paused. I built it myself. It took me 3 years. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a room full of experienced men encountering something they didn't have a category for. Taggart said quietly to no one in particular, "She measured it." Pruitt stood up. He was not a man who used his size aggressively, but when he stood, the room recalibrated around him. You built it yourself. You're 19 years old. You built a precision rifle yourself, and now you're going to shoot past 3 kilometers in desert conditions and keep us alive if this goes sideways. Is that the plan? If it goes sideways, Ava said. Yes. Pruitt looked at Holt. She needs more than range time. She needs combat time she doesn't have. You pull the trigger in a controlled environment, you know what you're going to feel. You pull it when there are people on the ground depending on that shot. When the margin is not inches but lives, that is a different thing entirely, and there is no shortcut to learning it. Ava said nothing. She was looking at Pruitt the way a person looks at a math problem. Not offended. Processing. Holt said, Demonstration range, 0800. Mercer, I want to see the rifle. She set up on the firing line alone. The team assembled behind the firing point with the specific body language of men expecting to be disappointed. Taggart had his binoculars. Farley leaned against a vehicle with his arms folded. Wren was watching with the open curiosity of someone young enough not to bother hiding it. Pruitt stood apart, his expression professionally neutral, which was the most damning expression he had. The range officer called, Target is 1,200 meters, standard silhouette, wind is gusting 8 to 12 from the northwest. Ava did not respond. She had been looking through the scope for 40 seconds already, which was long enough that Pruitt made a sound under his breath. Then she was completely still. Her breathing, which Holt had been watching, slowed to something that seemed anatomically difficult to sustain. Her right hand was so steady it looked like a photograph of a hand rather than an actual one. The rifle cracked. Downrange, the target's head marker snapped back. Center mass, the range officer called. Dead center. Pruitt said nothing. Again, Holt said. The rifle cracked a second time. The target took a hit fractionally left of center. Wind gust, Ava said without lifting her eye from the scope. 4 inches a push. I was late on the read. Pruitt said, 4 inches at 1200 is a miss in a live engagement. Ava made a minute adjustment to her position. The rifle cracked a third time. Perfect center, the range officer said. Holt said, move the target to 1500. The range officer looked at him. Sir, we don't have confirmed markers past 14. Estimate it, move the target. They moved it. Through Taggart's binoculars, the silhouette was a shape interrupted by heat shimmer barely distinguishable from the terrain behind it. Ava adjusted her scope with the focused patience of someone who had done this particular calculation 10,000 times. Wren beside Holt had stopped leaning and was standing straight. The rifle fired. Hit, the range officer called. There was something uncertain in his voice. Upper chest, clean hit. Holt looked at Pruitt. Pruitt was looking at Ava. His expression had shifted from professionally neutral to something more careful. He walked down to the firing line and stood over her. She did not look up. What's your confirmed record? He said. Real distance, not controlled range. Ava lifted her eye from the scope. She looked at Pruitt with those quiet dark eyes. 2,100 meters, 7 months ago. Open terrain variable wind. It was a field exercise, not combat. She paused. But the wind doesn't know that. Pruitt was still for a moment. Then he turned and walked back to Holt and said quietly in the voice he used when he was revising an assessment he didn't want to revise. She can shoot. I'll give her that. But the range is not the same as contact. If she freezes up when there are people on the ground, then we figure it out, Holt said. We move at 2,100 hours. The flight out was dark and loud and tasted like the particular anxiety of outbound. The team sat in the belly of the Blackhawk in the way operators sit before a mission still internal, not talking, each man running his own private accounting of what was prepared and what was not. Ava sat at the far end with the rifle case between her knees, her eyes on the middle distance, her lips moving very slightly in what Holt recognized after watching for a moment as calculation. She was not praying. She was doing mathematics. 40 minutes out, Holt moved down the bench and sat beside her. You know they don't trust you yet, he said. Yes, sir. You know why? Because I haven't earned it. You earn trust in this job by being there when it matters. I haven't been there yet. She was quiet for a moment. That doesn't change what I can do. No, Holt said. It doesn't. But it changes how you have to carry yourself until they see it. When we're on the ground, if you see something, anything, any read that feels wrong, you call it. Immediately. I don't care if Pruitt thinks you're wrong. I don't care if everyone thinks you're wrong. You call it out. Ava looked at him. There was a question somewhere in that look, but she didn't ask it. Not yet. Understood, sir. Holt nodded and moved back up the bench. 20 minutes from insertion, Pruitt moved down and sat where Holt had been. This was unexpected enough that Ava looked up. Pruitt looked at the rifle case, then at her. F. Mercer, he said. The name on the barrel. That's your grandfather. It was not a question. Yes, sir. Frank Mercer. You knew him? Pruitt was quiet for a moment. Knew of him. Every shooter in the teams knew of him. He paused. He built that rifle for you. It took him 3 years, Ava said. He started when I was 14. He said a rifle built by someone who loves you shoots truer than anything you can buy. She looked at the case. I don't know if that's physics or something else, but I've never found a reason to disagree. Pruitt said nothing after that, but he didn't move back up the bench either. They hit the ground at 2,300 hours. The Nevada desert at night is not quiet. It hums and shifts and breathes, and everything that lives in it has learned to move in ways that conserve heat and minimize visibility. The team crossed the dry lake bed in patrol formation, spread and low, and Holt led from the front, setting a pace that covered ground without sacrificing the attention that kept men alive. Ava and Wren split off 2 kilometers from the objective, moving toward the southeast ridge. Holt watched them go, 2 figures swallowed by the dark, and then turned back to the mission. 30 minutes in, his radio clicked. Overwatch is in position. Ava's voice was barely above a whisper. I have eyes on the compound. No movement visible. Wind is east-northeast, 7 miles per hour consistent. Copy that, Holt said. Maintain and report. The team moved through a dry wadi that cut toward the compound from the south. It was good concealment, and Holt didn't like it. Too many blind angles, too many places for a prepared position to wait. He was 2 kilometers out and running the terrain in his mind when Ava's voice came back on the radio. "Actual, this is Overwatch. Something's wrong." Pruitt's voice came in immediately low and controlled. "Define wrong." "The wind pattern. I've been watching the sand movement around the northwest approach for the last 18 minutes. There's a disruption approximately 400 meters from the compound's northwest corner. The crest pattern is wrong, too regular to be natural formation. Something is blocking the flow." Holt held up a fist and the team stopped. Pruitt said, "She's calling a halt because of sand patterns." Holt said, "Overwatch, can you be more specific?" "There's something buried in that position. Could be rock, but the geometry doesn't match the surrounding terrain. If I had to give you a number, I'd say 85% probability of a concealed vehicle or a prepared fighting position." A pause. "The satellite imagery is 48 hours old. Anything put in the ground after that window won't show." Pruitt said, "Dak." "We circle," Holt said. "Wide arc around the indicated position. Overwatch, keep eyes on that location. Any movement, any change, you call it." Pruitt said nothing further, but Holt could feel the controlled frustration moving through the team like a current. The time cost of the deviation. The tactical instinct that said, if there's nothing there, this detour gets the contractor killed. They circled. 12 minutes into the arc, Ava's voice came back, and the word she used first was enough. "Movement." Holt stopped. 2 individuals emerging from the indicated position. Now 3. They're armed. RPG configuration, 2 riflemen in support. They're moving to cover the original approach route. A pause that lasted 1 second. If you'd stayed on the original line, you'd be entering their engagement range in approximately 90 seconds. Holt looked at the terrain around him. He looked at Pruitt. Pruitt was looking at nothing in particular, his face very still. "Good call, Overwatch," Holt said. "Can you engage?" "Negative. They're in defilade from my position. I don't have the angle." "Copy. Team, we have confirmed hostiles. RPG Team 3 personnel northwest position. They don't know we've spotted them. We use that." What followed was 20 minutes of deliberate movement, the team circling around the RPG team's flanks while Ava maintained a running description of their positions and attention direction. When they were finally set, the hostiles were 90 meters away, unaware, watching the empty approach route they had prepared. The engagement lasted 4 seconds. 3 rifles, 3 targets. No sound that carried more than 50 meters. When they reached this position, what they found stopped the entire team cold. It wasn't just the RPG team. It was a network. Buried fighting positions, pre-sighted firing lanes with range markers cut into the rock face, ammunition caches in weatherproofed containers, communications equipment with pre-programmed frequencies. Someone had spent significant time preparing this ground. Someone who expected a rescue attempt and had built a system to destroy it. "Overwatch," Holt said into the radio. "You just kept this team alive. How many more positions can you identify?" "I'm counting wind anomalies at 7 additional locations around the compound," Ava said. "This whole approach is a prepared kill zone. Someone knew you were coming." Holt looked at the compound now 800 meters away. He looked at the network of prepared positions surrounding it. He thought about 42 kilometers and an 18-hour window and a contractor who might already be out of time. "Overwatch," he said. "Can you clear them?" A pause. "Yes, sir. But I need coordinates and a clear radio channel, and I need Pruitt on the spotter scope." Holt looked at Pruitt. Pruitt looked at the ridge where Ava was positioned 3,200 meters away, invisible in the dark. Then he got on the radio. "Give me a wind reading and I'll give you the targets," he said. What happened over the next 40 minutes was the kind of thing Holt had seen described in after-action reports but had never watched happen in real time. Ava worked from the farthest positions inward, clearing each prepared fighting point with the methodical patience of someone completing a proof. 11 shots, 11 targets. Ranges from 1,200 to 2,200 meters in desert dark, with shifting ground-level wind and the thermal distortion that comes off open sand when the temperature drops. Pruitt called each shot. Clean, upper chest, center, edge wind push. She read it correctly. He confirmed each one with the spotter scope and relayed without editorial comment, but Holt, who had known Garrett Pruitt for 6 years, heard something changing in his voice around shot 7. a quality of attention that was no longer the grudging attention of someone waiting to see failure. Something more like witness. Last position, Pruitt said. Eastern Ridge. Range to target 3,200 meters. It's a prepared sniper hide. Single-occupant scoped rifle watching the compound from elevation. He's got eyes on everything. Silence. Overwatch, Holt said. Can you take that shot? Yes, sir, Ava said. I need 60 seconds. Holt counted them. In combat, 60 seconds is not 60 seconds. It is a very long time to stand still in the dark with the knowledge that someone with a precision rifle is watching the ground your people are standing on. Then the rifle cracked, barely audible at their distance. Pruitt watched through the spotter scope. He said, "Target down. The approach is clear." Holt stood for a moment in the silence that followed. Then he said quietly to himself as much as anyone, "Copy that overwatch. We're going in." The contractor was where the last intelligence said he would be second-floor interior room behind a barricaded door he had reinforced with furniture and the particular ingenuity of a man who understands that his life depends on the next few hours. He was alive. Frightened in the specific way that comes from being alone for a very long time with nothing but worst-case scenarios, but alive and able to move under his own power. The extraction took 6 minutes. By the time the eastern sky was beginning to show color, they were at the extraction point. Ava and Wren came in from the ridge, moving down the long slope with the careful speed of people who had been on a cold hillside for hours. Ava looked exhausted in a way that was different from the team's exhaustion, more internal, more specific. Holt walked over to her. 11 confirmed, he said. Including the position at 3,200 meters, that's exceptional work. Ava looked at him. She didn't deflect or minimize, but she didn't take credit either. The wind was consistent, she said. Once I understood the pattern, the positions announced themselves. Pruitt walked over. He stood in front of Ava for a moment, and the silence between them had a different quality than the silence earlier in the day. That was the finest long-range shooting I've witnessed in 15 years, he said. I was wrong about what I thought you could do. I'm not wrong about everything, but I was wrong about that. Ava looked at him steadily. I know you weren't trying to be unfair, Chief. You were trying to keep your people alive. That's the right thing to want. Pruitt nodded. Once. Then he looked at the rifle case over her shoulder, at the initials on the latch. FM. Your grandfather would have been pleased, he said. Ava's expression changed just briefly, just at the edges in the way that a face changes when something true is said to it. He would have told me to account for the thermal gradient on shot 9, she said. I was 2 inches high. Pruitt almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. The helicopter came in low and loud and pulled them off the desert floor, and as they climbed away from the ground, Holt watched Ava through the green-lit interior of the cabin. She was looking out the window down at the terrain below, at the ridge she had spent the night on at the desert that had tried to kill his team and failed. Her hand rested on the rifle case. Her lips were moving again. Not calculation this time. Something else. Holt looked away and gave her the privacy of it. He had made a promise to a dying man, and for the first time in 14 months, he felt certain it had been the right one. Below them, somewhere in the dark that was slowly becoming morning, an intelligence analyst was pulling files on the confirmed target from the eastern ridge, cross-referencing the profile, running the biometric match against a database that reached across 3 continents and 2 decades of irregular warfare. By the time the helicopter touched down at Nellis, the analyst had a name. And the name had a connection. And the connection was going to change everything. The name was Alexei Dravin. Holt read the intelligence brief 3 times before he went to find Pruitt, which was not his usual habit. He was a man who processed information quickly and acted on it, who had learned that extended deliberation in this profession was often just fear wearing the clothing of caution. But the Dravin file was the kind of document that required reading slowly, not because it was complicated, but because each page added weight that the previous page had not prepared you for. 17 confirmed kills. Coalition forces across 4 operational theaters spanning 11 years. A methodology that intelligence analysts described in the careful language of people who admired what they would never say they admired as architecturally precise. Dravin did not simply eliminate targets. He constructed situations. He read terrain the way engineers read blueprints, identified the single structural weakness in any defensive plan, and applied exactly enough force at exactly that point to bring the whole thing down. The analyst note at the bottom of the final page was brief. It said the target eliminated at Eastern Ridge Operation Rattlesnake has been confirmed as Corporal Yuri Belenko, former Russian Federation Army, recruited by Dravin in 2019. Belenko was Dravin's longest-serving field operative and primary student. Dravin has not lost an operative of this profile in 11 years of activity. Then, underlined in the margin someone had written by hand, he will want to know who. Holt put the file down. He already knew the answer to that. The team assembled in the briefing room at 0600 the following morning. Colonel Diane Marsh stood at the front with the particular stillness of a commanding officer delivering information she does not enjoy delivering. CIA. Agent Bryce Lund sat to her right, a man in his mid-40s with a face designed to communicate nothing, wearing civilian clothes that were too clean for a forward operating base. Ava sat in the same corner as the first briefing, same chair, same position. But she was not the same person who had arrived 2 days ago, and the room knew it, and the room's relationship with her had shifted in the subtle but absolute way that rooms shift when someone has proven something that cannot be unproven. Pruitt was no longer standing against the far wall. He was seated. That was the whole difference, and it was significant. Marsh said, "The target Mercer eliminated at 3,200 meters during Operation Rattlesnake has been identified as Yuri Belenko. Belenko was the primary field operative, and according to multiple intelligence sources, the closest thing to a student that Alexei Dravin has ever had. Dravin does not make emotional decisions. He makes calculated ones. But losing Belenko is the kind of loss that changes a man's calculus." Lund leaned forward. "Dravin is currently operating somewhere in the Arizona theater. We've had 3 confirmed sightings in the past 10 days. He's not hiding, he's positioning, which means he's building towards something." He looked at Ava. "And our assessment is that he now knows who took Belenko. A 3,200-meter shot in a desert environment at night against a prepared position is not a signature that belongs to many people. It belongs to a very short list. Dravin is sophisticated enough to work that list." Ava said, "He'll find my name." "He already has," Lund said. "We intercepted a query through a third-party channel 40 hours ago. He was asking about Frank Mercer's family." The room went very still. Pruitt looked at Ava. Ava was looking at Lund with an expression that contained several things moving at once. None of them fear, but not all of them the same thing either. Holt said, "What's the proposal?" Lund opened a folder. "Dravin sent a message through a known intermediary channel. Not encrypted, which means he wanted us to see it. He's requesting a direct engagement with, and I'm quoting the exact language here, the heir of Mercer. One location, one time. He characterized it as a professional obligation." "He wants to test her," Pruitt said. "That's our assessment." "Why?" "Because Dravin was Frank Mercer's professional counterpart for the better part of a decade. They never met. They never directly engaged. But they operated in overlapping theaters long enough to develop what our analysts are calling a," Lund checked his notes, "a mutual professional awareness. Dravin knew who Frank was. Frank knew who Dravin was. And now Frank's granddaughter just took Dravin's best student from 3,200 meters. He paused. "In Dravin's world, that demands a response, not necessarily a violent one, a reckoning." Marsh said, "The CIA's position is that this is an opportunity. Dravin exposed enough to send the message. He's positioned in Arizona. If we can get eyes and a response team around his indicated location." "You want to use her as bait," Holt said. "We want to use a calculated lure to bring a target of significant operational priority into a position where he can be captured or eliminated. The distinction matters. It doesn't matter to the person doing the luring." Marsh looked at him steadily. "No, it doesn't, which is why this is voluntary." Everyone looked at Ava. Ava had been quiet through this. She was looking at the folder in Lund's hands. At the photograph of Dravin that was visible from her angle, a man in his 60s, broad-shouldered with a face that had been lived in hard. She was reading something in that photograph. She said, "He knew my grandfather." "Knew of him," Lund said. "That's not the same thing," Ava said. She looked at Holt. "I'll do it. Not because of the mission value, because he might know things about my grandfather that I don't." Holt said, "That's not a tactical reason. "No," she said. "It isn't." They inserted into the Arizona desert at dusk. The location Dravin had specified was a dry ridge system 20 kilometers southeast of Tucson terrain that offered multiple elevated firing positions and exactly the kind of interlocking sight lines that a man with Dravin's background would find professionally interesting. Lund had 3 counter-sniper teams positioned in concealed hides around the perimeter. Holt's team held a support position 800 meters back. Ava and Pruitt moved to the ridge Dravin had indicated, and Pruitt set up the spotter scope while Ava settled in behind the rifle. The desert went dark. They waited. At 2200 hours, a radio frequency came alive. Not a standard operational channel. Something older. A UHF band that the communications specialist had flagged as the type used by Soviet-era field operatives who had never updated their habits. A voice said in accented but precise English, "You shoot like him. Same patience. Same wind reads. He taught you well." Ava did not respond for a moment. Then she keyed her radio and said, "He had 30 years to practice. I've had 5. 5 years from 14 is 19, Dravin said. He started you early. He said I was ready early." A pause. "That sounds like Frank Mercer." Pruitt was scanning the terrain with the spotter scope, methodical and continuous, checking every position that offered an angle on their location. He had not found Dravin. He had not found anything, which for a man of Pruitt's skill and experience was itself a data point. Then Lund's voice came over the command channel, tight and clipped. "Counter-sniper teams, be advised we have movement on the eastern perimeter." And simultaneously Ava said, "East. There's a second shooter, 200 meters east of Dravin's signal origin. He's not targeting me." Pruitt swung the scope east. Holt on the command channel. "Confirm target." Pruitt said, "I see him. He's oriented toward..." A pause. "He's oriented toward the counter-sniper positions, not toward us. He's going to take out Lund's teams." Dravin had known. He had known from the beginning that this was a trap, had walked into it deliberately, and had positioned his own shooter not to protect himself, but to dismantle the mechanism surrounding him. The lure was not Ava. The lure was the entire operation, and Dravin's response was not to strike the center, but to remove the edges. Holt said, "Ava, you have authorization to engage the secondary shooter. Dravin is..." "I know," she said. She had perhaps 4 seconds before Dravin's shooter opened fire on the counter-sniper teams. Dravin himself was still transmitting, which meant he was stationary, which meant she had a shot. One shot against a man who had spent 40 years in the field, against a shot that, if she took it, ended the possibility of learning anything he knew. She chose the secondary shooter. The rifle cracked. 2,100 meters. 1 shot. The secondary shooter went down before he fired a single round. Dravin's frequency went silent. Pruitt swept the terrain. Nothing. No movement. No secondary contacts. Dravin had been positioned somewhere in that dark, close enough to transmit on a short-range frequency, and now he was gone. He had left behind only the GPS unit he had placed on a rock, which was still transmitting the coordinates that had drawn them here. And beside the GPS unit, visible in Pruitt's scope, a folded piece of paper. Taggart retrieved the paper. It was a set of coordinates. Arizona desert, 40 kilometers north. And beneath the coordinates, 7 words in the same precise handwriting. "The children need someone who can see." Holt showed it to Lund. Lund ran the coordinates. What came back was not a Dravin position. It was a 911 call that had come in 40 minutes earlier from a school district bus driver, cut off mid-sentence. A school bus carrying 15 children ages 6 to 12, dependents of personnel stationed at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, had been reported missing on Route 86. A militia group with a history of targeting military-adjacent civilians had been active in the corridor. The timeline was exact. Dravin had sent them here to this ridge at this time, knowing that while they were looking at him, something else was happening 40 kilometers north. Not his operation. A separate event he had become aware of and redirected them toward. Holt looked at the paper, then at Ava. She was already on her feet. They were in the air 18 minutes later. The bus had been moved to an abandoned cattle processing facility on a private ranch outside of 3 Points, a compound of concrete and chain link that offered good defensive positions and terrible approach routes. 15 children, 12 armed militia members. The closest law enforcement response was 40 minutes out and lacked the training for a hostage scenario of this complexity. Holt's team was 17 minutes out. Ava studied the satellite imagery on the tablet during the flight. The facility sat on flat ground with a single ridge system to the southeast, lower elevation than the Nevada position, shorter effective range, 1,800 meters to the bus location. She looked at the imagery for a long time, saying nothing. Wren, sitting beside her, said, "You can make those shots." She didn't look up. "I know." She traced a finger along the satellite image. "It's not the distance that concerns me." Wren waited. "The children are in the bus," she said. "The bus has windows on both sides. A hostile using a child as a shield doesn't give me a clean target. And a hostile positioned directly beside a child gives me a margin of approximately 6 to 8 inches before a miss is catastrophic." She looked at the image. "I have to be perfect. Not very good, not exceptional, perfect." Wren said, "You took 11 shots last night and didn't miss once. Those were adults, armed combatants in prepared positions." She was quiet for a moment. "This is different." Holt was listening from across the aircraft. He did not intervene. There were things a person needed to say before a mission of this kind, and the saying of them was part of the preparation. They inserted 600 meters from the ridge and moved fast. Ava and Pruitt broke off toward the elevated position. Holt took the rest of the team to a holding point 400 meters from the facility, close enough to move on short notice, far enough to avoid triggering the hostage takers before Ava was in position. "Overwatch in position," Ava said at 1,800 meters. "I have eyes on the bus. I can see movement inside. 12 hostiles visible, distributed across 3 positions. 2 are close to the bus, very close." "Copy that," Holt said. "Hold and observe. Law enforcement ETA is 38 minutes. We hold unless the situation deteriorates." "Understood." 22 minutes passed. Then a hostile emerged from the facility's main structure, and behind him, held by the upper arm, was a girl. 8 years old, maybe 9. She was crying in the way children cry when they have been frightened for a long time, not loudly but steadily, the way a small engine runs when it cannot stop. The hostile forced her to her knees in the center of the open ground between the bus and the main structure. He stood behind her. His right hand held a pistol at his side. Ava said, "They're moving toward execution. Female child approximately 8 years old. One hostile standing behind her, pistol in right hand. I have a shot." Holt said, "2 other hostiles within engagement range of the child." "Yes, 3 meters and 5 meters respectively. If the primary target goes down and either of them grabs the child before she moves, can you control for that?" A pause. "I can take the primary target before either secondary reacts. The child's movement after that is variable." Holt looked at the facility, at the open ground, at a little girl kneeling in the dirt 8 miles from the base where her parent reported for duty every morning. "Overwatch," he said. "You are authorized to engage. Take the shot when ready." What followed was the longest silence Holt had experienced on any operation. Pruitt was reading wind. Ava was reading everything else: the position of the secondary hostiles, the girl's posture, the angle of the late afternoon sun, the probability distribution of outcomes across the next 4 seconds. She was doing in real time the kind of calculation that most shooters did, with a spotter's help and a planning cycle and the luxury of conditions that never changed. The rifle cracked. The hostile dropped straight down completely, the way a body drops when the decision has already been made for it. The pistol struck the ground and did not discharge. The girl screamed and ran left toward the bus, and both secondary hostiles flinched toward the sound of the shot, not toward the child, and in that window of redirected attention she made it to the wheel well of the bus and pressed herself against it. Pruitt exhaled. Ava was already working the bolt. The remaining 11 hostiles went into immediate defensive posture, scattering, using the facility's structures for cover, trying to locate the origin of the shot. Ava engaged the 3 who moved toward the bus. 1 shot each. 3 targets down before the others had fully processed that the first hostile was gone. 8 remaining. All now in cover, none of them moving toward the children. Ava's voice, when it came, was controlled and specific. 8 hostiles in cover. 4 are in positions I can engage on movement. 4 are in the main structure, unknown sight lines. Children appear to be sheltering beside and beneath the bus. Holt said, "Hold your fire unless they move on the children. Law enforcement is 20 minutes out." "Copy." Over the next 18 minutes, Ava held the space around that bus the way a wall holds. 3 times a hostile attempted to reposition to gain an angle to move toward the children's location to test whether the shooter on the ridge was still there. 3 times the rifle answered before the movement completed. The remaining 5 hostiles stayed in cover and did not move again. When the law enforcement response arrived, vehicles and a helicopter coming in loud and fast from the northwest, the facility's defenders made the calculation that armed people make when the advantage has shifted entirely against them. 7 of the 8 surrendered within 4 minutes. The 8th attempted to flee through a back fence and was taken down by responding officers before he reached the road. 15 children were escorted from the bus. None of them were harmed. The helicopter back to Nellis was quiet in a way that was different from the quiet of the outbound flight. Outbound quiet is anticipation. It has a forward lean to it, a compression of energy held in reserve. The quiet on the return was something else. It was the quiet of people who have looked at something and cannot entirely look away from it even now that it was over. Pruitt sat beside Ava. He had not said anything since they left the ridge. He was looking at his hands, which was not something Holt had seen him do before. Finally, Pruitt said, "Fast 3, you read it. What happened?" Ava was quiet for a moment. "Wind gust. Came from the south off the terrain feature at my 9 o'clock. I was tracking primary. I read the primary wind correctly, but the crosswind from the south was a second-order variable. I was a half-second slow on." She paused. "The round was 6 inches left of center. It passed 6 inches from the child's head." Pruitt said, "I saw it." "I know you did. I didn't report it." "I know that too." Pruitt looked at her. "You need to understand something. 9 years ago I lost a teammate. We were on an extraction, and I had a shot, a legitimate shot, clear target, reasonable conditions. My hands weren't steady, not because of fear, because I had been operational for 72 hours and my body was running on nothing, and that catches up. I knew before I pulled the trigger that I wasn't right. I pulled it anyway because the alternative was waiting, and waiting wasn't available." He stopped. "The shot was low. It hit the structure behind the target instead of the target. And my teammate, who was moving into the breach on my signal, moved into a situation that he should not have moved into." He stopped again. "I reported it as equipment malfunction," he said. "A scope variance under thermal stress. It was reviewed and accepted. I have never told anyone what actually happened." Ava looked at him. "Your shot today was real wind," Pruitt said. "A genuine, unpredictable variable in a dynamic environment. 6 inches of deviation on a half-second late read at 1,800 meters is not a miss. It is the margin of perfect. But the feeling of it, the feeling that it almost wasn't enough, that feeling does not respect the difference between your situation and mine." He met her eyes. "It will stay with you. And I am telling you now before it calcifies into something that follows you onto the next scope. It was not your fault. The wind was real. The read was real. The shot was everything you had." Ava said, "And yours wasn't." "No," Pruitt said. "Mine wasn't." The helicopter moved through the dark. Ava looked at the rifle case, then out the window. "Is he still alive?" she said. "Your teammate." A pause. "No," Pruitt said. She nodded slowly. Something in her face acknowledged the weight of that, not with pity, but with the recognition of one person who carries weight for another person who carries it differently. "Thank you for telling me," she said. Pruitt nodded, leaned back, looked at the ceiling of the aircraft. Holt watched both of them from across the cabin and thought about the way trust actually builds, not in dramatic moments, but in the exchange of true things between people who have decided the other person can be trusted with them. 3 days later, Lund called a meeting that Holt did not know about until it was already happening. When Holt arrived, Lund was sitting across from Ava in a conference room at Nellis, a folder open on the table between them. Lund looked up with the expression of a man who had calculated the cost of what he was about to say and decided it was acceptable. Holt sat down. "We've been tracking Dravin through secondary channels since the Arizona operation," Lund said. "He's moved north. We have a position high-confidence 48-hour window in the New Mexico corridor, and we've picked up a signal from a network we've been watching for 2 years. 6 vehicles, coordinated movement converging on Fort Liberty." Holt said, "Fort Liberty has 3,000 personnel." "Yes." And you're telling me this in a room with my 19-year-old sniper instead of taking it to Colonel Marsh because Marsh already knows, Lund said, and because there's something else. He looked at Ava. The Dravin channel. We got a second message. This one wasn't sent to a mission frequency. It was sent to a private email address, one registered to a name that hasn't been active for 14 months. He slid a printed page across the table. It was addressed to Frank Mercer. The message said, I owe your family a conversation. I will come to Wyoming. I will come alone. I want nothing. Tell her to listen before she acts. Ava read it twice. Holt watched her face. She said, he's going to come to the house. Our assessment is yes. When? Within 72 hours of this message's timestamp, which was 4 days ago. Ava stood up. She picked up the rifle case. She looked at Holt. I need to go home, she said. Holt looked at Lund. Lund had the expression of a man who understood that some variables do not respond to management. Go, Holt said. She went. Holt remained in the room after she left. He looked at Lund. Everything in that Dravin file, he said. The Afghanistan history, the 1991 operational record. What is he to Frank Mercer? Lund was quiet for a moment. The honest answer, Lund said, is that we don't fully know. There's a classified operation from 1991 that both of them appear in on opposite sides, and the operational record for that event has gaps that suggest deliberate redaction. Someone didn't want the full picture on file. He paused. What we do know is that after 1991, Frank Mercer filed a single unclassified note in his personnel record. It said, encountered a professional I respect, closed. Holt thought about that. And Dravin retired from Russian state service in 1994, Lund said. His retirement paperwork, which we obtained through a third party, listed one reason, 4 words. Lund looked at the table. It said, met my limit once. The room was quiet. Holt stood up and picked up his cover and walked to the door. Behind him, Lund said, there's going to be a problem, Holt. Fort Liberty, the vehicles. If Dravin is coming to Wyoming and we have a 6-vehicle attack on a base with 3,000 people, we're going to need her back before she's ready. Holt stopped at the door. He did not turn around. I know, he said, and walked out into the Nevada afternoon, where the light was flat and white, and the mountains in the distance looked like something a person had put there to remind you how small you were and how much depended on how clearly you could see. The house in Wyoming smelled like gun oil and pine and something older than both. Ava had grown up in this smell, had learned to read it the way other children learn to read weather, by what it meant, by what it preceded, by the particular combination of elements that told you whether the man in the next room was working or thinking or doing the thing he did. When he missed her grandmother, which was cleaning a rifle he had already cleaned twice that week. Frank Mercer had lived in this house for 31 years. He had built the back porch addition himself, had refinished the kitchen floor. Twice had kept a garden that produced more zucchini than 2 people could reasonably consume, and that he tended with the same patient precision he applied to everything. His reading chair still held the indentation of his particular weight. His coffee mug was still on the counter because Ava had not been able to put it away. She sat at the kitchen table in the dark and waited. She had not told Holt exactly when she expected Dravin. She had not told anyone. She had driven from the Cheyenne airport in a rental car with the rifle case in the back seat, and she had let herself into the house with the key that still lived under the third porch step, and she had made coffee she did not drink and sat down to wait. At 2 a.m, the front door opened. Not the back, not a window. The front door, which she had left unlocked, because if Alexei Dravin was the man his file suggested he would know she had left it unlocked, and he would understand what that meant. He was taller than his photograph, broader. He moved with the deliberate economy of a man whose body had been a tool for a very long time and who had learned to spend it carefully. He wore civilian clothes, dark jacket, plain trousers, and his hands were visible and empty. He stopped inside the doorway and looked at the kitchen and at Ava sitting at the table, and he did not seem surprised by any of it. He looked at the rifle case leaning against the wall beside her. He said, "You left this door open." "You sent the message to a dead man's email address," she said. "I figured we were done pretending." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He was 63 years old. His face had the quality of terrain that has been through multiple seasons, Not worn down, but reshaped, marked by what had moved across it. His eyes were pale and very steady, and they held the specific quality of eyes that have spent decades looking at things from a long distance. Ava looked back at him with the same steadiness. "You knew my grandfather," she said. It was not a question. "I knew of him for many years," Dravin said. "I knew him directly for approximately 45 minutes in November of 1991. Afghanistan, a valley in Kunar province. There was an operation. Your side had objectives, my side had objectives. And neither set of objectives included the 12 civilian families who happened to be sheltering in the compound at the center of both sets of objectives." He placed his hands flat on the table. "Your grandfather had a firing position on the western ridge. I had a firing position on the eastern ridge. We had been watching each other's positions for 6 hours without engaging, which was itself a kind of conversation." Ava said, "What happened?" "One of my team members without authorization moved toward the compound. He intended to use the civilians as leverage. I stopped him." Dravin paused. "The stopping was visible from your grandfather's position. He had a shot at me in the moment I was exposed. An excellent shot. Clear target, favorable conditions, perhaps 800 meters. He looked at his hands. He did not take it." Ava was very still. 3 weeks later, Dravin said, "I received a communication through a neutral channel. No name. Just the coordinates of my position on that ridge in 4 words. He reached into his jacket and removed a folded piece of paper. Not new. The folds had been opened and closed many times, the creases worn to softness. He placed it on the table and pushed it toward her. She unfolded it. The handwriting was her grandfather's. She had grown up reading that handwriting on ammunition logs and wind charts and grocery lists and the birthday cards he sent every year without fail, always on the actual day, never a day early or late. Good shot. FM. She read it twice. Then she read it again. "He saw what you did," she said, "and he called it a good shot. He saw a man choose not to do something terrible when he could have done it without consequence," Dravin said. "In his profession, as in mine, restraint is the harder skill. Anyone can pull the trigger. The discipline is in knowing when not to." He looked at her. "I kept that paper for 33 years. I showed it to no one. But I knew when Frank Mercer died, I have channels for such information, and I knew that he had a granddaughter who had inherited his gift and his rifle, and apparently his willingness to let a man live when there was reason to." "I let you live in Arizona because I needed information," Ava said. "No," Dravin said. "You let me live in Arizona because you read the situation correctly and made the better tactical choice. The information was secondary." He looked at her with those pale, steady eyes. "That is exactly what Frank would have done." Ava folded the paper carefully. She held it in both hands. "You said in your message that you owe my family a conversation," she said. "Is this it? Or is there something else?" Dravin reached into his jacket a second time and placed a USB drive on the table. "Bryce Lund," he said. "Your CIA contact." Ava looked at the drive. 2 years ago," Dravin said, "a network I had prior contact with, I will not detail the nature of that contact, approached me with a contract. The target was Fort Liberty, New Mexico. 6 vehicles, coordinated approach, maximum casualties. I declined. I do not work against active military installations. There are things I will do and things I will not, and that falls on the wrong side of the line." He tapped the drive. "What I learned before I declined was that the network had received the installation's internal schedule, patrol rotations, and physical layout from a source inside the American intelligence community. That source's identifier appears on this drive." Ava looked at him. "It's Lund," she said. 2 years ago, Lund ran an operation in the same corridor that went significantly wrong. 8 coalition personnel died in circumstances that were later attributed to bad intelligence. The actual cause was a planning failure that Lund was responsible for. He has been managing that exposure since then, providing low-level information to the network in exchange for their silence. Dravin looked at her steadily. "The Fort Liberty operation is scheduled for 71 hours from now. The vehicles are already moving." Ava stood up. She picked up the USB drive. She picked up the paper. She looked at Dravin. "Why bring this to me?" she said. "You could have sent this to anyone." "I could have," Dravin said. "But Frank Mercer's granddaughter was the one who earned the right to it." He stood. He was very tall in the low kitchen light. "Also," he said, and something in his voice shifted the faintest change in register, I wanted to see if you were what I thought you were. And you are, he said. You are precisely what he was, and you are also something he was not, because you are 19 years old and you already understand the difference between the shot you must take and the shot you must not. He moved toward the door. That took Frank Mercer until he was 42. He stopped at the front door. One more thing, he said without turning around. The vehicle the network is using for the 6th position, it will not have a driver. Remote detonation triggered by radio signal. A receiver module approximately 15 centimeters mounted beneath the chassis. Destroying the vehicle will trigger the bomb. The receiver must be targeted directly. He paused. It is a difficult shot. Ava said, how difficult? At the range where you will need to take it, Dravin said, it is the kind of shot that only exists in theory. He opened the door. Your grandfather would have said it was a math problem. I suspect you agree. He walked out into the Wyoming dark, and the door swung quietly shut behind him, and Ava stood in her grandfather's kitchen holding a piece of paper that was 33 years old and a USB drive that was going to change everything, and the house was very silent around her. She looked at the rifle case. She picked up her phone and called Holt. Lund was taken into custody at Nellis at 0400. He did not resist. He sat in the chair across from 2 federal agents with the particular stillness of a man who has been waiting for a specific knock on a specific door for a very long time, and when it finally came, found that the waiting had been the worst part. Colonel Marsh ran the operational briefing at 0600. The room was the same briefing room. The team was the same team. But the air in the room had the quality of air in a room where people understand that what is about to happen is not a mission. It is the mission. 6 vehicles. 3 convergence routes. The Cimarron Canyon Corridor in northern New Mexico, a 12-kilometer stretch where the terrain funneled all 3 approach lines through a single geographic choke point before opening onto the flat ground that led to Fort Liberty's eastern perimeter. 3,200 personnel on base, families in adjacent housing, a 6-hour window before the vehicles reached a dispersal point where interception became impossible. Air support could handle 5 of the 6 vehicles if the approach was confirmed and the window held. The 6th vehicle, no driver remote detonation receiver module beneath the chassis, required a precision strike that air-delivered munitions could not guarantee without triggering the device. Marsh said, the receiver module is 15 centimeters across, at the range where an overwatch position offers a clear sight line to Vehicle 6's approach route. The engagement distance is approximately 2,800 meters. She looked at Ava. This is voluntary. I need you to understand that completely. Ava said, where do I set up? They inserted into the Cimarron Canyon system at dusk. The ridge Ava and Pruitt chose sat at the canyon's southeastern wall, a natural elevation that offered sight lines down 2 of the 3 approach corridors and a partial view of the 3rd. The ground was red sandstone and dry grass, and the particular silence of elevated terrain where the wind moves differently than it does at canyon level. Holt's team took positions at the canyon's northern exit, the last physical barrier, before the approach road to Fort Liberty opened up. Wren set up the communications relay. Farley staged his medical kit with the methodical quiet of a man who does not think about the reason he is staging it. Taggart looked at the canyon and said to no one in particular, it's good ground. He meant for defending. He also meant it was good ground for what was about to happen, which was one woman with a rifle deciding whether 3,000 people went home. Pruitt set up the spotter scope beside Ava. The sun dropped behind the western canyon wall. The temperature fell 15 degrees in 20 minutes, which was how canyon environments worked. No moderation, no transition, just the immediate arithmetic of shadow. Ava lay behind the rifle and looked through the scope and read the canyon. She had been reading it since they arrived. The way the wind came down the western approach in the late afternoon carried a rotation at the canyon mouth that would produce a left-to-right push at mid-range and a variable correction at distance. The heat signature off the canyon floor would create a thermal shimmer layer at approximately 1,200 meters that would require holdover adjustment. The sandstone walls on either side produced a secondary wind echo not strong enough to deflect a round significantly, but enough to mislead a shooter who was reading primary wind only. She cataloged all of it and filed it and lay still. At 2100 hours, Holt's voice came over the radio. Convoy is confirmed moving. 6 vehicles. ETA to canyon entrance approximately 40 minutes. Air support is 15 minutes out and holding. Copy, Ava said. Pruitt said wind is 9 miles per hour from the northwest. Thermal layer is dissipating. Temperature correction point 4 mils at 2000. Ava made the adjustment. They waited. The first vehicle entered the canyon at 2143. It was a heavy truck, modified suspension, moving at speed. Through the scope, it was a shape and a heat signature and a problem with a specific geometry. Ava solved the geometry. The rifle cracked. The truck's engine compartment erupted. The vehicle veered hard left, struck the canyon wall, and stopped. The driver's door opened and a figure ran directly into Holt's team, which was the contingency they had planned for, and it resolved in 4 seconds. Vehicle 1 down, Holt said. The second vehicle came in faster, the driver having seen or heard something that told him the approach was not clean. It was moving at close to 70 miles per hour and varying its line, cutting left and right across the canyon floor in irregular intervals. Pruitt read the movement. Pattern interval is approximately 3 seconds. He'll cut right on the next cycle. Ava did not shoot at the truck. She shot at the space the truck was going to occupy in 1.4 seconds at a point on the canyon floor where the geometry of the truck's movement and the geometry of the round's flight path would intersect. The truck cut right. The round was already there. Vehicle 2 down, Holt said. The third and fourth vehicles came in together staggered, using each other as visual interference. Ava took Vehicle 3 on the approach and transitioned to Vehicle 4 with the bolt before the echo of the first shot had finished moving down the canyon. 8 seconds between shots. Both targets down. Wren on the communications relay said something under his breath that Pruitt chose not to repeat. Vehicle 5 made it 400 meters into the canyon before Ava engaged it. The driver had turned off his headlights, which in the scope made no difference at all, and had slowed to reduce the acoustic signature, which was tactically reasonable and strategically insufficient. Vehicle 5 down, Holt said. Where is 6? A pause on the radio. Vehicle 6 has not entered the canyon, the air support coordinator said. We have it on thermal holding at the canyon entrance. It stopped approximately 90 seconds ago. Ava said, It knows. Pruitt looked at her. The remote operator knows the other 5 are down, she said. He's deciding whether to send it through or trigger it at the entrance. She was looking through the scope, watching the canyon mouth. If he triggers it at the entrance, the blast radius reaches the canyon walls, but not the base. If he sends it through, he has to send it without a human driver on a programmed route and hope it reaches the flat ground before someone stops it. A pause. He's going to send it through, she said. Because stopping now means the whole operation failed and he has nothing. Sending it through means there's still a chance. Holt said, How long? 30 seconds. Maybe less. 22 seconds later, Vehicle 6 entered the canyon. It was moving at a precise, mechanically consistent 40 miles per hour, the speed of a programmed system, not a human driver. No variation, no response to terrain. A straight line down the canyon floor toward the flat ground and Fort Liberty beyond it. Ava found the chassis in the scope. The receiver module was there, a rectangular housing mounted to the underframe forward of the rear axle, 15 centimeters across, moving at 40 miles per hour at 2,800 meters. Pruitt said, Wind is shifting, coming off the eastern wall now. Correction is... He stopped, recalculated. Wind is variable. I can't give you a clean number. Read me the shift. Primary is northwest at 9. Secondary off the eastern wall is approximately east-southeast at 4 to 6. They're combining at your range into something I can't model cleanly. Ava looked at the receiver module moving through the scope. She had done this her entire life. Not this shot specifically, but this problem, the problem of a system that could not be fully modeled, where the variables exceeded the capacity of sequential calculation, where the answer was not arrived at by solving for each component, but by reading the whole thing simultaneously. The wind and the distance and the movement and the thermal layer and the canyon echo and the specific way the reticle floated in the scope when conditions were unsettled. Her grandfather had called it listening. He had said there is a moment before the shot when the rifle tells you, not in words, in the way it sits, in the way the reticle moves or does not move, in the feeling of the whole system, your body, the rifle, the air between you and the target, settling into a single coherent thing. When that happens, you do not think. You complete the action that has already begun. She felt it now. Pruitt was beside her reading wind, his voice steady and precise. And without looking away from the scope, she was aware of something else, a presence at the edge of the position beyond Pruitt, standing still in the way that only very practiced people stand still. She did not look. She did not need to. Dravin said quietly, "East wall is dropping. The secondary wind will fall off in approximately 4 seconds. You'll have a 2-second window of primary only." Pruitt looked up sharply. Ava said, "I know." She watched the reticle. The secondary wind fell off. The reticle settled. She did not think about the receiver module. She did not think about Fort Liberty or 3,000 people or her grandfather or the 33-year-old piece of paper in her jacket pocket. She thought about nothing. She completed the action that had already begun. The rifle cracked. The round traveled 2,800 meters in just under 3 seconds. The receiver module disintegrated. The vehicle's guidance system died. The truck's programmed route vanished mid-execution. The vehicle coasted, decelerating, drifting left until the front wheels found the canyon wall, and it stopped there against the sandstone 200 meters inside the canyon entrance. The bomb did not detonate. The signal that would have detonated it had nowhere to go. The canyon was very quiet. Pruitt exhaled slowly through his nose. Holt's voice came over the radio, and it had the quality of a voice that has been held very carefully for a long time and is now allowed to release. "Fort Liberty is secure," he said. "All 6 vehicles down. Ava." He stopped. "Start it again. That's done. Come home." She lifted her eye from the scope. The canyon below was dark and still. 5 destroyed vehicles and 1 coasted to a stop, and the flat ground beyond the northern exit clean and empty, all the way to the lights of Fort Liberty on the horizon. She became aware slowly that Dravin was gone. She did not know when he had left. He was simply no longer there in the way that certain people are not there completely without remainder. On the ground beside the spotter scope where Pruitt's water bottle had been, there was a folded piece of paper. Pruitt picked it up, looked at it, handed it to Ava. It was her grandfather's paper, the one Dravin had carried for 33 years, the one that said "Good Shot FM" in her grandfather's handwriting in the faded ink of a message written in 1991 by a man who was 30 years away from dying and did not know it. Below the original text, in different ink in a different hand, precise and spare and European, in its letter forms 2 words had been added. So did she. Ava read it once. She folded it along the original creases and placed it in her jacket pocket against her chest and held it there for a moment with her palm flat. Then she sat back from the rifle and looked up. The sky above the canyon was the particular dark of high desert at altitude, not the flat dark of cities, but a layered dark, deep and dimensional. The kind of sky that reminded you the atmosphere was thin up here and beyond. It was an enormous amount of nothing, and that everything that mattered happened in the thin part. Pruitt sat down beside her on the sandstone. He did not say anything. He looked at the canyon and the sky and the distant lights of the base where 3,000 people were going about the ordinary business of a Tuesday evening, without knowing how close Tuesday had come to not happening. Taggart and Farley came up from the lower position and sat down. Wren sat beside Taggart and looked at the stars in the way young people look at stars when they have just been through something that has rearranged their interior geography. Holt arrived last, coming up the ridge slope with his rifle across his back and his pace measured. He looked at Ava for a long moment. Then he sat down on the other side of her. He did not say anything for a while. Then he said Frank would have appreciated that shot. Ava thought about that. "He would have asked me about the secondary wind off the eastern wall," she said. "He would have said I should have read it 3 seconds earlier." "And what would you have said?" "I would have said he was right." Holt looked at her. "He would have said something else after that." Ava reached into her pocket and held the folded paper. "Yeah," she said. "He would have." She did not take the paper out. She held it through the fabric of her jacket the way you hold something you are not ready to fully look at yet, but are not willing to put down either. The team sat on the sandstone ridge above Cimarron Canyon and let the night be what it was, large and cold and indifferent to human stakes. The way the desert is always indifferent, the way the wind is indifferent, measuring nothing, honoring nothing, simply moving from high pressure to low, finding the path that physics requires and following it without hesitation or doubt. Ava had learned to read that indifference, had learned to find in it not emptiness, but information. The wind does not care who you are. It does not adjust for your intentions or your history or the weight of what you carry. It simply moves, and if you are patient enough and honest enough about what you see, it tells you exactly where the round will go. Her grandfather had taught her that. She was 19 years old, and she had made 11 impossible shots in a Nevada desert, and she had saved 15 children in an Arizona canyon, and she had just put a round through a 15-centimeter target at 2,800 meters in variable wind conditions to stop 6 vehicles and protect 3,000 people who would never know her name. None of that was the thing she was proudest of. The thing she was proudest of was smaller and quieter and harder to explain. It was the moment in the kitchen in Wyoming when Alexei Dravin had walked through the door she left unlocked, and she had looked at him, a man with 40 years of field work and a file that should have made him terrifying. And she had made the decision to listen before she acted. That was what her grandfather had left her. Not the rifle, not the technique, not the 3,000 hours of range work or the hand-loaded ammunition, or the understanding of wind that read like a second language in the part of her brain that processed pattern and motion and the subtle grammar of moving air. The gift was the capacity to be still enough to see what was actually there. Everything else was just math. She put her hand flat against her jacket pocket, against the folded paper, against the 2 sets of handwriting that bridged 33 years and 2 sides of a war and 1 canyon in New Mexico, where a decision had been made not to pull a trigger. Good shot. So did she. The wind moved through the canyon below, steady and clean, carrying the cold down from the high ground the way it always had, the way it would long after everyone on this ridge was gone. Ava listened to it and understood every word.